For 6 days, the dog sat at the door. Not the front door, not the garden door, the door to the small downstairs bathroom, the one Joan used in the night when the stairs felt like too much, the one with the grab rail Michael had installed 18 months ago when Joan had mentioned once that she sometimes felt unsteady in the mornings. Patch sat at that door.
He sat there in the mornings when John was in the kitchen. He sat there in the afternoons when John was in the sitting room with the television on. He sat there at night, which John only knew because she came downstairs at 2 in the morning for a glass of water and found him. Not sleeping, not pacing, just sitting, facing the door. Still in the specific way of a dog who has identified a problem and appointed himself its guardian. Joan told him to move. He moved. The next morning he was there again. She mentioned it to her daughter-in-law on the phone on the Wednesday. "Patch is being odd," she said. "He keeps sitting at the bathroom door. You know how he gets?" Her daughter-in-law said that sounded like typical Patch behavior and asked whether Joan was eating properly. Joan said she was fine. She had been saying she was fine for several months, in the specific way of a retired nurse who knows the language of concern and knows also how to manage it from the other side. She was fine. She was a little tired. She was occasionally breathless on the stairs. She had a dull ache in her left shoulder that she was putting down to the way she slept. She was 69 years old. She had spent 41 years as a nurse. She knew the signs. She was fine. On the 6th day, Joan woke at 5 in the morning with a pain in her chest. She lay still for a moment. She was a nurse. She knew exactly what to think about next. She thought about the aspirin in the bathroom cabinet. She thought about the phone on the bedside table. She thought about the specific quality of the pain, its location, its radiation. The accompanying symptoms she ran through in the organized way of someone who has assessed 100 patients and is now, for the first time, assessing herself. She reached for the phone. She called 999. The paramedics arrived in 11 minutes. Joan had unlocked the front door and was sitting on the bottom stair when they came in. Patch was beside her. Not at the bathroom door anymore. Beside Joan, pressed against her left side. Because in the 6 days he had been telling her something was coming. And now it had come, and his job had changed. As the paramedics carried her out, Joan looked back at Patch in the hallway. His tail moved once. "There's a dog," she said to the paramedic. "Can someone call my son?" "Tell him Patch was trying to tell us," she said. She was right. And the story of how a border collie understood something about a woman's body that everyone around her had missed. How he communicated it for 6 days in the only language available to him, and how nobody listened until it was almost too late, is a story that a cardiologist and a canine research team would spend the following year trying to understand. This is that story. 6 days. Patch sat at that door for 6 days. And for 6 days, everyone around him found a reason it was something else. This story is about what we miss when we don't know how to listen. And about a dog who kept trying to tell the truth until someone finally heard it. Subscribe now if you are not already. Ring the bell. Because what comes next in this story is something that the scientists who studied it called one of the most detailed documented cases of canine cardiac alert they had ever encountered. And before we go further, has an animal ever behaved in a way you couldn't explain at the time, and then something happened, and suddenly you understood? A dog that wouldn't leave a room. A cat that stayed close for days. Drop it in the comments. We read every one. And after what you are about to hear from the scientists who studied Patch, you will understand why those stories matter more than most people know. Joan is not a real person. Patch is not a real dog. The cardiac event, the 6 days at the door, the son who didn't know what to hear, none of that is invented from nothing. It is built from the real and growing body of documented cases in which dogs have detected serious medical events in the people they live with before those events occurred, and from the research that is slowly building a framework for understanding how and why. We created these characters so that the truth underneath them could be told as clearly as possible. If this story reminds you of something that happened to someone you love, that is not a coincidence. Joan Hartley had been a nurse for 40 1 year, and in that time she had developed the specific, practical, unsentimental relationship with illness that the best clinical nurses develop. She did not catastrophize. She did not panic. She assessed, she acted, she moved on. She had trained at the Royal Derby Hospital at 18, had worked in general medicine for 15 years and cardiology for 26, and had retired at 67. In her leaving party speeches, colleagues said Joan Hartley was the person you wanted in the room when things went wrong. Calm, precise, never rattled. Her husband Geoffrey had died 3 years before her retirement. She had managed his illness and death with the competence she brought to everything clinical, and had grieved him afterward in private, and without ever quite letting anyone fully into the center of it. Michael was 43, a project manager in Leeds, an hour's drive from Joan's house in the market town of Ashbourne. He came once a month, called twice a week. He was the kind of son who showed up, which John valued and expressed by having his room ready and a meal prepared whenever he arrived. She had Patch. Patch had arrived 2 years after Geoffrey's death, at Michael's suggestion. Joan had said she'd think about it and had, 3 weeks later, come home with an 8-week-old border collie puppy from a farm outside Matlock. She had researched breeds and concluded she needed a dog with a job. Border collies were dogs with jobs. The fact that she lived alone in a market town, rather than on a working farm, was a logistical detail she was confident she could manage. She managed it through structure and through honesty. She spoke to Patch directly, in complete sentences, and Patch responded with the attentiveness of a dog who understands he is being taken seriously. By the end of the first year, they had established a routine of such precision that Joan's neighbors could set their clocks by their morning walk. What Michael had been noticing over the past 4 months was that Joan seemed tired in a way she was explaining away. The breathlessness on the stairs she was attributing to the stairs. The shoulder ache to sleeping position. The occasional dizziness he only knew about because her friend Barbara had mentioned it. He had raised it once. Joan had told him he sounded like a hypochondriac on her behalf. He had filed the worry in the place where he filed things he couldn't act on. He had not known what to do with Patch sitting at the bathroom door. Joan had mentioned it on the Wednesday call, the 4th day of the sitting, in the tone she used for Patch's more eccentric behaviors. Affectionate, slightly exasperated, very easy to hear as nothing. He heard it as nothing. 2 days later he was in a meeting in Leeds, when the call came from Joan's neighbor, whose name appearing on his phone had made his hands go cold before he answered. Patch had been Joan's dog in the full sense from the first week. He had attached to her with the focused intensity of a border collie, who has identified his person and organized his entire existence around them. He followed her from room to room. He monitored her movements with the vigilant attention of a dog who cannot quite believe she will still be there when she comes back from the kitchen. He had required, Joan told Michael, the most consistent and creative management of any living thing she had worked with in 41 years of nursing. She had managed him through structure, the 7-15 walk, the training sessions, the routine of sufficient complexity that Patch's considerable intelligence had something to work on. What Michael had not understood, until afterward, was how much Patch had been reading Joan across those 2 years. How carefully and continuously he had been building a model of her rhythms, her patterns, her specific physiological signatures in every mood and state. The breathlessness on the stairs, which Joan attributed to the stairs. Patch had been watching her on the stairs for weeks. The pause at the landing that Joan barely registered. Patch registered it every time. The shoulder ache, which Joan attributed to sleep. Patch had been sleeping at the foot of the bed and had noted, without any framework to put it in, that Joan was moving differently in the night. More restless. More often awake. The slight change in her pallor on the harder mornings. Joan filed it as tiredness. Patch stored it with everything else. He did not have a diagnosis. He did not have language. What he had was an accumulation. Weeks of small deviations from the baseline of Joan, that he had spent 2 years establishing with the thoroughness of a working dog given an important task. On the Monday of the 6th day before the ambulance, something shifted. Joan could not have told you what. She felt, if she was honest, much as she had felt for several weeks. Patch went to the bathroom door. Not the front door. Not the kitchen. The bathroom door. He sat in front of it and faced it and did not move. Joan told him to shift. He shifted. She went to make tea. She came back. He was at the door again. She sat in her armchair and applied the clinical part of her mind to it. The part that assessed behaviors and looked for patterns. She had been applying that part of her mind to other people's symptoms for 4 decades. She did not apply it to herself on this occasion with the same rigor, because applying it would have required following the reasoning to its conclusion, and the conclusion was something she was not quite ready for. She told Michael on Wednesday. She used the tone that made it easy to hear it as nothing. Michael heard it as nothing. Patch sat at the door for 2 more days. The ambulance had taken Joan to the Royal Derby Hospital, where several of the nurses on the cardiac ward knew her by name. She had a myocardial infarction, serious, said Dr. Patel, but caught early enough. Clinical language for she made the call in time. The outcome could have been very different. Michael had driven the hour from Leeds with the controlled urgency of a man keeping himself functional, because the alternative was not useful. He sat beside Joan's bed and held her hand. He said, "I did. In time. Just about." Michael was quiet. "The shoulder ache, how long?" "Some weeks." "And the breathlessness?" "Longer than that." "You knew," he said. Joan was quiet. "I suspected." "There is a difference." "Did Patch?" He stopped. Joan looked at him. "Patch was sitting at the bathroom door for 6 days," she said. "I mentioned it to you on Wednesday." The silence that followed had several layers to it. Michael drove back to Ashburn that evening to check on Patch, who was at Joan's neighbor Barbara's house. When Michael came in, Patch looked at him for a long moment. Then he went to his food and ate. Michael sat in Barbara's kitchen and thought about 6 days and a bathroom door, and a tone of voice that had made it easy to hear as nothing. He had been trying to respect his mother's autonomy. He had been trying not to be the son who treats a competent adult like a patient. He had been getting the balance wrong in one specific and consequential direction. And a border collie who could not speak and could not call 999 had been getting it right. The question Michael sat with was not why hadn't they listened. It was something more specific. What had Patch known? And how had he known it? We want to stop here. Because what just happened in that hospital, the call made just in time, the paramedics there in 11 minutes, that outcome existed because Joan was a nurse who knew what the pain meant the moment it arrived. But the 6 days before that morning, the 6 days Patch sat at the door, those days existed because Patch knew something was coming before Joan felt it. Before she had anything to respond to, he was trying to tell them. In the only language he had, "We want to ask you something. Has an animal ever seemed to know something before you did? Before anyone did? It doesn't have to be medical. Just the sense that an animal was reading something the humans in the room were missing. Tell us in the comments. We read every one. And after what you are about to hear from the scientists who studied Patch, you will understand why those stories matter more than most people know. Now, back to Michael, who is about to ask a question that changes everything. Joan came home from hospital after 9 days. She had made some adjustments. The adjustments did not include getting rid of Patch. Michael had not suggested this, had not come close to suggesting it, but Joan had pre-empted the conversation anyway. "Patch stays," she said at dinner, having not been asked. Michael said he had no intention of suggesting otherwise. Joan's GP, Dr. Nachukwu, was thoughtful and had been Joan's GP for 8 years. At the post-discharge appointment, she listened to Joan describe Patch's 6 days at the door with genuine open-mindedness. "It's very possible that Patch was responding to changes in your behavior," she said carefully. "You were sleeping poorly, moving more carefully on the stairs. Dogs are extraordinarily sensitive to behavioral change in their owners. He may have been responding to what he observed, rather than detecting the cardiac event itself," Joan said. "He sat at the bathroom door." "Not at me, not by me." "At the door." Dr. Nwachukwu paused. "That is a more specific behavior than I'd expect from general anxiety response. It might be worth talking to someone who studies this. Michael's friend Dave was less nuanced. Come on, he said over a beer. The dog sitting at a door is not the same as the dog detecting a heart attack. Dogs sit at doors. That's what they do, Michael said, for 6 days, without moving. Specifically that door, Dave said, has a border collie. They're obsessive. You're pattern matching because of what happened. Michael sat with this because Dave was not unintelligent and the explanation was not unreasonable. But he thought about Patch in Barbara's kitchen watching the door. He thought about what he knew of Patch. 2 years of monthly visits. 2 years of watching this dog operate. Patch's obsessive behaviors were task-focused, not random. The door was not a random door. It was the door Joan used at night. The door with the grab rail. The door nearest to where a person would be if they collapsed alone. He called the research charity Dr. Nachukwu had mentioned. The researcher who answered was Dr. Caroline Webb. She had been studying canine olfactory detection of medical events for 6 years. She had one question before she said anything else. What did Patch do when the ambulance came? Michael said. He moved from the door to her side. He pressed against her left side. A brief silence. Left side. Dr. Webb said. Cardiac left. Another silence. I'd like to come and meet him, she said. Joan recovered well. Patel said so at the 6-week follow-up with the satisfaction of a cardiologist whose patient has done everything they were told. She was walking again. The morning walks were shorter than before, not the 7:15 sharp of before, and not the distance, but the walks were there, and Patch was beside her. The crisis was not Joan's health, which was stabilizing. The crisis was what Dr. Webb found. She came to Ashbourne in December and spent 4 hours with Joan and Patch and described it afterward as the most compelling spontaneous detection case interview she had conducted in 6 years of research. She explained, sitting at Joan's kitchen table, what she believed had happened. Patch's olfactory capability is approximately 10,000 times more sensitive than yours, she told Joan. Cardiac events involve a cascade of biochemical changes in the days and hours before they occur, changes in inflammatory markers, metabolic byproducts, stress hormones. These produce chemical signals in breath, sweat, and skin that are detectable by a dog who knows a person's baseline well enough to register a deviation. Joan listened with the specific quality of attention she had given to clinical information for 4 decades. He was detecting the pre-event chemistry, she said. We believe so, yes. And then communicating distress in the only way available to him, proximity to the location he associated with your vulnerability. The bathroom, the grab rail, the place where, if something happened, you would need help. Joan was quiet for a moment. He didn't sit with me because he couldn't make me understand what he meant. That interpretation, Dr. Webb said, if we can document and publish it, has significant implications for how we think about dogs as early medical detection partners. The problem was documentation. To publish, she needed a case series, multiple documented instances, not just one. And to do the research properly, she needed funding. Her funding application had come back at 60% of what she had asked for. The equipment for olfactory analysis was expensive. The committee had cut it. She explained this to Joan and Michael, with the directness of a researcher who has learned that people who have lived a story are often the best advocates for the research it generates. Joan looked at Michael. Michael looked at Joan. Patch looked at both of them and appeared to find the situation satisfactory. What would you need to close the gap? Joan asked. Dr. Webb gave her the number. Joan was quiet. Not about the number, she had reasonable savings. About whether she wanted her story to be a public story. She had been a private person her whole life. She had not told people about the shoulder ache or the breathlessness. But she thought about the 6 days. About the door. About what Patch had known, and what everyone around her had not known how to hear. She thought about how many people were living with dogs who might be telling them something they didn't have the framework to receive. What if we told people? She said. Michael already had his phone out. Michael wrote the post. Joan reviewed it, made 3 corrections, 2 factual, 1 tonal, and said it was fine and to post it. She was going to make tea because she didn't want to watch the notifications. By Friday morning, the local post had been shared to the regional page. By Friday afternoon, it was national. The responses sorted into categories Michael had not anticipated. The first was people who had a patch. A Labrador who had pawed at a sleeping husband's chest for 3 nights before the husband was diagnosed with an arrhythmia. A terrier who had refused to leave an elderly woman's side for a week before she fell and fractured her hip. A spaniel who had kept sniffing at a teenager's arm before the teenager was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. People who had never connected the behavior to the biology. Who had said it was just the dog being the dog. Who had, reading Michael's post, experienced the retroactive recognition of something that had been in front of them, that they had not had the framework to see. The second category was healthcare professionals. GPs who had had patients describe something similar. A cardiologist in Manchester who had been talking to a veterinary colleague about exactly this intersection for 2 years. The third was researchers. 3 of them, in adjacent fields, who had been watching Dr. Webb's work and had been waiting for a case with this level of specificity. Dr. Webb called Michael on Saturday morning. Her voice had the quality of a person managing excitement with effort. "I've had 3 research inquiries since last night," she said. "And a journalist from the science section at a national paper." Joan, told this in the garden while deadheading roses, said, "Good," without looking up from the roses. In the tone of a woman who has assessed a situation and concluded it is proceeding correctly. The funding gap closed within 4 days. Not from a single source, from an accumulation of small donations from people who had a patch. People who had a parent or a spouse. People who felt the specific movement of something important being finally said. The total exceeded Dr. Webb's requirement by 30%. The excess went, at Joan's instruction, to a cardiac awareness charity. Dr. Webb's institutional budget was reinstated in full when the research committee saw the public response and reconsidered their position. The study began in January. Dr. Caroline Webb's research ran for 14 months. It encompassed 9 cases in total, Joan and Patch as the index case, 8 additional cases gathered through the response to Michael's post. Different dogs, different medical events, different owners. A Labrador and an atrial fibrillation, a mixed breed and a hypoglycemic episode, a German Shepherd and a stroke, the dog having been found pawing at a bedroom door for 3 days before the event. The pattern across 9 cases was consistent enough to support what Dr. Webb called a compelling case for spontaneous pre-event olfactory alert behavior in domestic dogs living in close contact with an at-risk individual. She came to Joan's house in March to walk through the findings. "What I want you to understand," she told Joan, "is that what Patch did was not magic. It was applied chemistry. He detected a specific change in your biochemical profile, changes consistent with the pre-infarction state, through a sensory system that is orders of magnitude more sensitive than anything human medicine currently deploys in domestic settings." She paused. "He was, in functional terms, a smoke alarm. Except the alarm had no way to make the sound you were trained to respond to." Joan considered this. She had spent a lot of time with this image over the past months. "So he found the closest thing," she said. "The bathroom door. The place with the grab rail. The place where, in his model of your household, a person who needed help would be." Joan looked at Patch. "Clever boy," she said. Patch's tail moved once. The paper was published that April. Pre-cardiac event olfactory alert behavior in domestic dogs, a case series of 9 spontaneous incidents. It was the most widely reported research paper in canine medical detection in a decade. Cited by cardiac nurses, GP practices, a hospital piloting an animal-assisted monitoring program for at-risk elderly patients living alone. Seated in a parliamentary briefing on preventive health care for over 60s. Cited by a medical alert wristband manufacturer who contacted Dr. Webb about a collaboration involving trained dogs to trigger the devices. That last development Joan found particularly satisfying. Quietly and without making a fuss about it. Michael came down in April, the weekend the paper was published. They sat in the garden, Joan in her chair, Michael on the bench, Patch distributed between them, back end on Michael's feet. Front end pointed at Joan. "He was doing a lot of things last October that we didn't notice," Joan said. Michael was quiet. I should have listened better. You didn't have the framework, Joan said. None of us did. She paused. Would do now. The wristband went on Joan's wrist in May. She wore it without complaint, checking it occasionally with the expression of a nurse checking a patient's device. And every morning, at 7:15, she and Patch went out the front door together. The route varied. The time did not, but Joan walked it differently now. Her eyes were open to what the dog beside her was telling her. She had learned, finally, to listen. Autumn came back to Ashburn the way it always did. The market square with its particular quality of October morning light, the kind that makes ordinary things specific and temporary and worth paying attention to. The smell of the air when the season has turned and the warmth is present still but the cold is underneath it, announcing itself. Joan walked with Patch through the market square on a Tuesday morning in October, exactly 1 year from the morning of the call. She had not marked this intentionally, or she had told herself she had not marked it intentionally, which was not quite the same thing. She was 70 now. On the medication, with the device on her wrist, seeing Dr. Patel every 4 months. She had, in the past year, allowed more of the support available to her than she had allowed in the several years before. She had not become someone who was managed or handled. She was still Joan, but she had adjusted. She had adjusted to answering Michael's Wednesday call with something other than fine, when fine was not quite accurate. To saying the shoulder ache and the breathlessness rather than the stares and how she slept. She had adjusted to listening differently to Patch. This was the most significant adjustment, and also the simplest. She watched him now with the attention she had always given her patients, looking for change, looking for the deviation from the baseline, looking for the behavior that did not fit the pattern. Doctor. Webb had sent her a signed copy of the paper. Joan had put it on the shelf in the sitting room, the place she put things that mattered. Michael had framed a photograph, Joan and Patch in the spring garden, taken from a distance. Both facing away from the camera, Joan in her usual chair, Patch beside her with his nose lifted to something in the air. Just the two of them, doing what they always did. The photograph was on the mantelpiece. Joan walked through the market square in the October light and thought about a year, about a door and 6 days and a tone of voice, and the specific failure of the people who loved her to hear what was being said, because nobody had given them the language for it. She thought about all the other Joans. All the other houses with the dog sitting at the door, and the person saying it's just how he gets. Patch walked beside her, his nose to the October air, his ears forward, reading the morning. Joan looked at him. "What do you know that I don't?" she said. Patch looked up at her with the amber-eyed attention of a dog who takes this question seriously. His tail moved. Joan smiled. "All right," she said. "We'll see." They walked on through the market square into the morning, the two of them together, each listening for what the other knew. For 6 days Patch sat at the door. Nobody understood what he was saying. Not because the message was unclear, it was the clearest thing in that house, but because nobody had the language to receive it. Joan did everything right on the morning the pain came. She called when she needed to call. She got help in time. She survived. But those 6 days before the morning, those are the days this story is really about. The days the alarm was sounding and everyone had a reason it was something else. We are not telling you to panic every time your dog sits somewhere unusual. We are telling you something much simpler. Pay attention. When an animal who knows you really knows you. The way Patch knew Joan across 2 years of 7-15 walks and television evenings and every morning of her life. When that animal does something it has never done before, something specific and persistent and directed, ask the question, not the question about the dog, the question about yourself, or the person it's watching. Share this video with every person over 60 who has a dog and lives alone. Share it with every adult child managing a parent's health from a distance. Share it with every GP and every cardiac nurse, and every researcher still building the framework that Patch was already working from. Because the science is real. The cases are documented. And there are dogs right now, in houses all over the world, sitting at doors that nobody has thought to ask about, Subscribe if you are new here. We are back every week. Ring the bell. And our final question, the one we want you to sit with today, is there something your dog has been trying to tell you? Not metaphorically. Specifically. A behavior that doesn't fit. A persistence you've been explaining away. Something directed and repeated, and not quite like anything they've done before. Tell us in the comments. Because Patch could not speak. But you can. Listen to the dog. That is all. That is everything.